It's my pleasure to welcome you to this talk that we're hosting this evening on the occasion of an exhibition that we have here on the first floor, hopefully that you've all seen. If not, I strongly encourage you to see it at some point. Titled Field Station Daniel G. Baird. And tonight we have the artist Daniel here with us. Daniel joins us from Chicago, where he is based. So thank you, Daniel, for being here this evening. And then also joining us is Mark Auslander, who is the newly appointed director of the MSU Museum here on campus. So we're very happy to have him here, and thank you, Mark, for joining us. Daniel and I have been working on his exhibition for a number of months, I don't know, 6 to 8 months, something of that sort. So we really wanted to bring in a different voice into the conversation to not have it be so insular between the two of us. And, ever since meeting Mark and frankly his interest and enthusiasm for the show has kind of blown us away. And so I think for that reason, as well as his wide-ranging interest, we thought he would be the perfect person to join us here this evening. I don't think there's a single topic that Daniel or I could throw at Mark that he doesn't seem to have knowledge of, or else exceeding knowledge of. So yeah, we're excited to have him here today. So I think just briefly by way of a little introduction to Daniel and his work. He's an artist that I've known for about 10 years now, actually. We met in Chicago. I was in graduate school. He was in undergrad at school, the Art Institute of Chicago at the time. And I was curating a small exhibition in an apartment gallery in Chicago, put out an open call, and Daniel, I think, applied to it. I think that's how that all played out. Or else someone I know through some network, we got in touch. But Daniel exhibited this work that, actually there's a photo of it in this slideshow here that will kind of continue to roll throughout the conversation. But it's called the Homo habilis hand axe, and it's actually, I think or half of the sculpture is an actual kind of ancient hand axe, ancient tool that was used. And Daniel scanned it and then 3D printed it. And so there were these two objects, one a kind of real or authentic object, and then one that was scanned and interpreted by this computer system to create this other object. And I was totally enamored by that work, and since then, we've maintained a relationship. We've worked on a number of other projects together, but this for sure is the most kind of intense and focused show that we've produced yet. And so I'm really, really happy to have him here, to be able to work together with him again. And to produce his first museum exhibition in his career. So it's really a special occasion. I'm going to let Daniel talk a little bit about the exhibition, but just to kind of give a little bit of premise for the way this talk is going to kind of unravel, is that you have here a selection of slides on the screen that are rotating, and those slides were selected primarily by Daniel. And I think I'm going to ask him to talk about a little bit how he selected some of those images, but mixed into those slides are also Daniel's artworks and images of the exhibition. And I think it'll be kind of interesting, maybe perhaps for you all, to kind of try to figure out which is his artwork and which is not. That's not his artwork. I can confirm that. Sorry, Daniel. So that's going to kind of play throughout in the background, but throughout the conversation we'll be touching on different works, and at some point I may stop and focus on certain slides to kind of really dig in a little bit deeper into some of those issues related. And yeah, so to kick it off, I think I'm just going to kick it over to Daniel and ask him to maybe talk a little bit about some of the images that you're looking at, but then also kind of some of the ideas and the processes that were involved in creating the exhibition that's on view here at the museum.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Stephen, for those kind words, and thank you, Mark, for being here. I'm really looking forward to this. So the images that I've selected are images that resonate with me, and then have been kicking around in a folder that I have on my desktop that I just continually populate. That also then translates into a Tumblr feed, which I think some of you may be familiar with. And it's more of I consider them research images that I'm constantly returning to and that I draw inspiration from. And they emerge out of nowhere from something that I come across or through something I've read that I want to look further into and remember and return to. So they're seemingly, I think, diverse, but they're also not at all, and very connected and form all the other pieces that I've produced. So I like that you referenced this piece that I made a long time ago, which was a replica of a Homo habilis hand axe, which is considered to be the first tool in this piece of formed flint. And what I did with this tool was I put it through a 3D scanning process and reproduced it through a 3D printer. And what I was interested in with that was taking this base origin tool and having it confront a very, very advanced technology of today, and then show them side by side and merge them together. And that idea, that base idea, I think is something that is present up until today. And with the main centerpiece in the show, that's something that I'm interested in as well, and I think is activated with that. So that piece emerged from thinking about these ideas of deep history and contemporary ways of understanding representation. So where does that start from? I find this interesting analogy in thinking about a phone, like the phones we have. Yeah, right there. Or a screen.
Oh,
that's the early piece, actually. A screen or a phone or these objects that we look at continuously, they're more or less just continuations of a deep lineage that emerged from representations on cave walls, from my perspective. So in thinking about producing these works, I wanted to collapse those distances in time. And for me, that meant going to a cave itself, and then how do I utilize this place, and how do I represent a cave or draw that connection? And I came across this process of producing, of mold making, where I'm able to produce a one-to-one mold. So it made sense for me to go to a cave and actually function almost like an archaeologist and excavate the cave itself and represent that in order to directly access or point to that interest that I had. And paired with that, with what's presented here at the Broad, is also a merging of two different bodies of work. So I had produced these pieces that involved replicas of cave walls, and then there was another interest that I had in this idea of a horizon. And for me, this idea of the horizon is connected to really an idea of sublime. So it's a very simple gesture, and I feel like within a horizon line, it presents a sublime experience. So what's presented here is a merging of these two bodies of works, with the horizon and this origin of representation contained in cave walls.
That's great.
Fantastic. Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Mark Auslander. I'm a sociocultural anthropologist with deep interest in tools and the deep history, comparatively, of art all the way back to the Upper Paleolithic period that we see flashing across here. And I'm also the director, as has been mentioned, of the other museum on campus, the MSU Museum and I have a lot of deep interest in natural history museums as well as cultural history museums. So the breadth and intellectual rigor and imagination of Daniel's work is really inspiring for me. So I'll just throw out a few thoughts about the work. We've been talking on and off about it for a while, and each time I look at this installation, Field Station, I'm endlessly fascinated and new thoughts emerge and are inspired. So especially as a museum person, so the series of work in this gallery, as you know, that Stephen and Carla, two of the curators here, are sort of alternating. It's called field stations. So in a sense, every installation is different, but it's always field station. And field stations have a very complicated relationship to museums. They're sort of out there in the Amazon or, in Olduvai Gorge or in Antarctica. They're the places that museums depend on and gather the exotica of the world in, but they're emphatically not museums. So it's quite marvelous, this sort of space that is out there and now brought into the gallery world. So that we get a kind of fascinating motion that is really intensified, I think, in Daniel Baird's work, so that we have a kind of fascinating time travel and as well as spatial travel. So as you look through the installation, on the one hand we have these molds that come out of this 40 million year old cave with that wonderful horizon line that Daniel has mentioned, that is also reminiscent for geologists and paleontologists of what's known as the KT line, a line of what seems to be iridium laid down in many stratigraphies when you dig down deep, where you see that line of the great extinction that leads to the loss of the dinosaurs, except for the birds that continue to survive. When we built, the great asteroid came in 60 million years ago, lays down this line of iridium across the planet, and marks this era of mass extinction. So we're kind of moving back in time through that, but also in space. So the three vitrines that Daniel has created that take us into a sort of marvelous museum-like world, each with different fossilized tortoise shells. And the more you look at the fascinating enigmatic cracks in those shells, you have a sense of a mysterious world of maps, and that relates to at the end of the gallery, as you go sort of through the cave and can look at it from either being within the cave or imagining yourself, as Daniel has said, sort of embedded in the rock, looking out towards what it would be like to sort of be in the rock, looking at the cave from the other side. Then you come to the end, and there's this enormous sort of wind chime with a fascinating title that is, in fact, the latitude and longitude coordinates. And if you plug that into your iPhone or your Android phone into Google Maps, up will come just a stretch of blue. And I think you have to hit, at least I had to hit 13 times to get to seeing land, because it turns out to be a part of the South Atlantic that will flash in front of you in a moment. Somewhere above Antarctica, southeast of Tierra del Fuego, with a little bit of South Africa. So it's a space that is mappable, but also outside of discernible space that's sort of floating in the air. So we're moving around in space, but also in very fascinating ways in time. And this is really something that museums do. There's a wonderful historian of the early modern era of that period, just as cabinets of curiosity, the forerunners of modern museums, are being created, the scholar Stephen Bann. And he asks, where do these strange cabinets of curiosity that started to emerge in the 16th and 17th centuries, where do they come from? Where early intellectuals were collecting all manner of exotica, including the fossils that Daniel loves, and shark's teeth, and strange weapons, and all the things that eventually end up in museums. Well, he points out they happened precisely in the places of the early Protestant Reformation, where early Protestant intellectuals had been engaged in the mass destruction of medieval Catholic reliquaries, places where, the bone of, from the finger of John the Baptist and so forth were being kept. So they destroyed those because that was sort of excessively papist, they felt, and then they were overcome with longing, with sort of a nostalgic desire to bring back that sense of the divine that you could almost touch, that could intercede for you with the mysteries of the cosmos. So to hear Daniel talk about this longing for the sublime, to me is perfect, because museums are actually, that pretend to be rationalist spaces that are scientific, especially natural history museums, but they're actually infused with a deep longing, and that certainly goes back to the medieval era, to somehow touch the eternal, to somehow touch the great mysteries of the cosmos. In the medieval era, you know, we knew that the mysteries of God were not fully available to us, but we began to sort of map them out. And this is a longing that continues through the scientific inquiry in field stations and so forth to try to grasp the eternal. We put them in museums, we try to put them in boxes, and somehow that enormous energy of the mysteries of the universe keeps on sort of spilling out, which I think happens in Daniel's work as well. But I love as well that, Daniel, that you take us into the universe of caves. Daniel and I have been talking about a very fascinating book by David Davis Williams, called The Mind in the Cave, which is on consciousness and the origin of art. And he tries to understand what is it that happened somewhere between 40,000, 30,000, 25,000 years ago, when human beings don't seem to be doing art and then suddenly are doing fantastic art. As you, right, there's that little point in the Atlantic that's both mappable and unknowable that the work harkens us to. As these works start to appear all over what's now southern France and northern Spain, human beings have mastered fire. They're maybe battling or mating with Neanderthal. Something new is happening in the human mind. And they're creating these very fuzzy, energetic spaces in caves, lit presumably by torches. The book suggests, The Mind in the Cave, that what we're seeing, this kind of energy on the cave walls, is reproducing certain kinds of hallucinatory experiences undergone by shamans in deep, dark spaces with a little bit of light, and then they sort of see this tunnel-like, cave-like vision of all these dots, which they then try to fix on the cave wall, which becomes a living membrane between this world and the other world. So perhaps at the origin of what we think of as the modern human mind is a deep religious longing to understand the natural world as being intimately bound up with the social world. So there's so many fascinating things as Daniel takes us through 50,000 years of the evolution of consciousness and tools, or even longer, from those early screens of the cave to the iPhones and the Android screens that now dominate our lives. But there's another kind of time travel that Daniel's taking us through that I want to sort of close with, and that is the very famous Allegory in Plato's Republic, written 2,500 years ago, but it still remains one of our foundational texts for thinking about reality and imagination, and that's Plato's Allegory of the Cave. For him, what we think of as reality is illusionary, right? It's the sort of text that the Matrix harkens back to, and he imagines prisoners inside a cave, and that is really all of us who glimpse from they can't see the sun, but they think they're seeing reality. The shadows flickering on the wall, perhaps from those that are people that are marching by with puppets and so forth, and they think the shadow is the reality. He imagines what it would be like to stumble. This is the philosopher, right? Who stumbles into the light, is blinded by it, comes and then says, look, what we see as shadows is really just distant echoes of reality. But everybody, of course, when he comes back in, explains he's crazy, he's mad, they're going to lock him up, they're going to kill him, and so forth. That's the experience of the philosopher, of anybody that challenges the dominant model of reality, because that's what's seen on the cave wall, our original screen. So there is in the 20th century philosophy an enormous battle over just what Plato's getting at. For Martin Heidegger, the great German philosopher, this is all about the nature of form, that modern consciousness really perceives the world, he says, as what's called a world picture. We can't really think of reality unless seen through a screen, or seen through a window, or seen through the rectangle of a painting, or of a movie theater, and so forth. And science is all about, we can't actually imagine what life is like without the screen, which we think is reality, and so forth. And it's, and Daniel's work seems to play around with the question, is science liberating? Does it in fact confine our very motions of consciousness? Now, in contrast to that, Hannah Arendt, the great anti-fascist philosopher, says, no, what Plato's really getting at is not just about form, it's really about politics and about the most urgent questions of our day, which is that to really think, to think critically, is to challenge fundamental assumptions about the world that dominate this society, and that which imprison us all, that all of us are so easily seduced by what's on the screen and become willing slaves of the powers that dominate society. We write our own ticket, that for her the most powerful prisons are the ones that we ourselves construct. And this turns out to, rather surprisingly, in this day and age, where we see the global resurgence, one could argue, of fascism or authoritarianism, of xenophobia, of a longing for the strong man who's going to tell us all what to think, in which television becomes not just a technique, but becomes the very model in which we have reality TV stars now dominating the political in so many ways, now with the capacity to lob nuclear weapons and so forth at each other, that the screen is not just a metaphor, it is the very space in which we imprison ourselves by being seduced by the glory of everything we see on screens, and longing for something which we claim is authentic, for somebody who's going to be so tough, so bellicose, so charismatic, that he's going to seem to burst through the screen and change the world. And in so doing, perhaps we re-imprison ourselves. So that's what I find exciting, that Daniel's work can be thought of in terms of the whole history of philosophy, and political philosophy as well. And yet here in Field Station, we see the possibility, as in Plato's cave, that some sense can be knocked into all of us as we burst through the cave, to the other side of that screen, and have to contemplate from both sides the cave that potentially imprisons us, but also potentially liberates us. And that is, I think, one of the remarkable gifts of this artistic intervention. So thank you for that.
This is, I mean, I could just do this all day. I mean, this is exactly what I had hoped for. So thank you for that, Mark. That's fascinating. Daniel, do you have, is there anything that you would like to say in response to that?
Wow, there was a lot just touched on there. Initially, early on, when you were speaking about museums and the vitrine, one thing that I like thinking about with the pieces and shows, that there's very much a play with that, the museological framework of something. And I intentionally do that. So presenting these tortoise fossils, they're contained within these vitrines in order to lend a very particular type of authority to them. But at the same time, I was cautious to not have them just be artifacts. So I felt like there needed to be something specific that was modified to them, and paired with this interest that I've had in this idea of the horizon. And as you saw, an image of this point in the middle of an ocean, that's my interest in the idea of a horizon, which is this absolutely sublime experience where the feeling of the natural world is overpowering you, but also more so just the idea that individually you're experiencing something very emotional and very heavy. So another analogy, I feel like sitting in front of a screen and looking at the internet is a version of the sublime, in the sense that you can look at anything. It's just a sea of information, but the imagery is just constantly bombarding you, and it can change continuously, and that's a different version of the natural world overtaking your senses. But right, so the vitrine, I felt it important to do something that anchored into this museological presentation in order to lend a type of authority, but also put a kink to it. So what I did was I removed horizontal plane from the actual vitrine itself. And in doing that, that created it disrupted the authority of putting something in a glass box and having it be outside of one's experience in a whole nother world of sterile, an infinite world, presumably, and brought it back into one's experience. So in seeing that horizon line, you then have this understanding that you share the same space with this artifact, but at the same time, it's also contained in this display device that is familiar nowadays as a museological presentation.
I liked what you always described as kind of like by creating that gap in the vitrine, that we share the same air with the object, right? And if it's behind the vitrine, it's somehow isolated from us. And I always really liked that, this idea that, like the same air that we're breathing is somehow circulating within that, and therefore something about that kind of accessibility, or the idea that we're kind of in the same breathing space seems to kind of create this intimacy that is in a way reinforcing but also deconstructing that barrier that is the vitrine, right?
Yeah, and with those objects, my base interest in using them, these tortoise fossils, comes from two different realms. One is very much adding to this tortoise as containing the world on its back. The idea that the world is contained right on the top of a tortoise, and then that tortoise is then on top of another tortoise, and another, just kind of infinite regress. And also this idea of it being this object that you observe, and you have this association that it is historical, and you have this understanding that it is a fossil, or it comes from a different time. And I've sourced those particular fossils because they have this rawness to them, and they have this freshly excavated feeling. Like they're not museological. By museum standards, they're not up to par. They're pretty raw and messed up in a good way, for me. And that good way is in the immediacy that I feel like they have from being freshly taken. And this, in an abstract way, I feel like those tortoise shells to me are photographic. So taking this idea of the tortoise containing the world on its back, at its moment of demise, presumably, it captured that world from where it came, and then that was buried, and then it was excavated, and when it was brought back out of the ground, it contained that world from where it came still. So it's kind of, for me, it feels like a metaphor of, it's like looking at it's like looking at a museum diorama of the entire world, but not being able to actually peer into that world. It's like a locked system that's inaccessible, but is informed by the mythology that we're familiar with of the tortoise.
But this nicely relates to what Mark was just talking about, this idea of, the image or the picture, and that we are talking about three-dimensional objects, but still, I think there's a lot of relationship to that idea of the image, because the cave walls that you create too, as Mark noted, have a front and a back. And really, perhaps in the installation we privilege one side, but really they're both equally as interesting, in the sense that, perhaps also you can talk a little bit about the digital techniques that you're using to create those works, and this idea that when you're creating these digital models, if anyone has experience with creating digital models or architectures, you can pass through them and see them from within in a way that they're not their volumes are not solid in the same way that, ordinary objects are. And so in a way, even though you're creating three-dimensional objects, they have these digital qualities to them or something of that sort.
Yeah. So I think that I'll just speak about my desire in sourcing the cave. It came from the idea of caveness. And for me, I could source any type of subterranean cave, and that was enough to stand in as a reference for every single type of other cave, with the potential for this type of archaeology of representation. And I was careful not to go to a cave that had a very particular history to it. I felt like that would be something that was too direct, that I didn't want to have be the focus. So in seeking out these caves, I asked some friends, and many people said, oh, you should go to Kentucky and go to Mammoth Cave and go to these other caves that have certain types of artifacts within them or imagery already on the walls. And I didn't want that. I just wanted a blank cave, caveness, which that's fairly Platonic. That's yeah. But what ended up happening is I found these caves in Iowa, and I kept returning to this cave, one cave in particular. So the reverse happened, where I wanted to not have there be importance to this reference that I was seeking, but it then became important, and it became more and more important the more I returned to this place. And it generated a provenance. And now this cave that I've gone to over and over again, I feel like it's the cave.
That's great.
It's like,
yes. So in the immortal
Yeah.
words of Buckaroo Banzai, wherever you go, there you are.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
that's fantastic. But I love, so the non-specificity of the cave, the initial non-specificity of the cave is, of course, lets you do this archaeology of the human mind, right? So you're going into the deepest sort of stratigraphy of consciousness, back to this shared experience, which for us is going back in time probably to early childhood, or even before language, what Lacan calls, the sort of real, where, but then also back to the origin of maybe human consciousness in the cave, way back when. And yet, at the same time, I love that, because this is what makes art so interesting, because the moment you come up with any analysis, the opposite turns out to be true. It becomes a very specific place. Because what the work of the museum in putting these boxes around things and these frames and these vitrines and so forth that we love is both to preserve things, but also to say this is not just a thing. It is an exemplar. It is an example of medieval armor, or of the Cretaceous or whatever, and yet something else bleeds through in museums, which is why we keep going back to museums and being so interested in them, and why the label never manages to quite capture what's going on. So I love that the vitrines are open, and to me that also harkens back to that weird paradox I keep thinking about, that we had these great Catholic churches in the medieval period with these relics that allowed us to almost touch the divine, and then we get rid of those and we put in rational scientific museums where everything's behind glass and safely guarded away, but something still continues to bleed through in that open vitrine, in which the horizon line, which is that experience of being on the open ocean, off the map, opens up to us. So and we're suspended between being everywhere in general and yet in a specific place. And that is a very interesting aspect of the artistic process that can take us so many different places at once, which is quite exciting. It's why I love going in there, and every time something new appears.
Yeah, in relation to that, there's some pieces that are in the show which are tinted plaster replicas of these objects called universal power adapters. And these are these tools that you encounter when you need to use electricity in another country. And you have your US plug, two-prong plug. And I came across these objects that are, I also consider them as these type of non-object horizon line things because they're meant to be invisible. They're meant to just provide a translation point. But I became fascinated with these objects for two reasons. One, because of the audacious name of universal power adapter. I find that interesting and strange. But also that the type of service that they provide is of this translation, this like movement of energy. And I couldn't stop thinking about these objects, and I felt like they were very important. So I had one of them that I had used a number of times, and I wanted to draw a connection between this idea of power translation and hierarchies kind of supplanting one another. So I decided that I would replicate these objects and replicate them specifically in the tones of geological sediment. And with that, the idea is that these things, these objects, the multiples in there, I wanted there to be the feeling that they came from different periods of time embedded directly beneath us and everyone on Earth from different layers of sediment. So in a sense, different moments of geologic time represented different moments of certain types of power. So
I'm just going to jump in because that makes me think of the wonderful conceit in Neil Gaiman's American Gods, which some of us anthropologists often think is the best thing ever written by about American culture, because he has to figure out why is it as you travel across America, unlike other parts of the world, you're constantly coming across the world's largest onion or peach or the world's largest. Why are Americans always obsessed with these places that they build? And he thinks because there are these sort of subterranean energy sites, these places of power that Americans, as rationalists who like to think we are always trying to tap into. And it's, of course, one of the most ancient ideas that there are these places of power on the landscape that people are drawn to. So I love that idea of the universal power adapter underneath each one of these ancient tortoise shells that's kind of radiating out energy, which we are getting recharged in various ways as we tap into something.
Well, there's also another one of these kind of conundrums within your work, right? I mean, this idea of the future artifacts. So you have real artifacts that are part of your works that are the tortoise shell pieces, and then you have these other pieces that are kind of these speculative artifacts, right? And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about your interest in that idea, but also the acknowledgement that, especially around technology and screens and the proliferation and kind of great exponential increase of technology in our lives, but also the increase of their obsoleteness. Is that a word? You know what I mean? The way, the speed at which technology becomes obsolete as well is kind of constantly creating potentially a vast archive of artifacts as they get buried and otherwise kind of cast away. But.
Yeah, I think my interest in some of these museological ideas came from that idea of thinking about technology in that specific way, and this realization that objects of technology from the very recent past appear ridiculous to us. Like a cell phone, from the early 90s is just kind of absurd looking.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I find that interesting that, at some point, it's inconceivable right now, but this thing right here is going to be ridiculous and, silly looking in 15 years or something like that.
3, 4.
Yeah, 3. Yeah, right. Some of my thinking came from that, and this radical replacement of, technology, how that just occurs continuously, and it's supplanted by other things, or other new technologies, and that paired with this very modernist idea of progress, as though we're moving towards something better, but is that really true? That's part of the premise of what I've been thinking about, and that relates to what I had mentioned before about this idea of a cave wall and the screen being essentially the same thing. They're along the same trajectory, and they're showing something very similar to the idea that when you look at a television screen, you're in essence sharing the same type of experience of viewing flickering on a cave wall of a representation.
Which is Herzog's idea in Cave of Forgotten Dreams, that fantastic film, in which he argues that what we're seeing on the cave walls there was the origin of cinema, or you have to. That's why he's constantly flickering his torch. They start to move. We imagine that this is such a brand new invention, but this is really what we've been drawn towards for so long. That film is simply the realization of a very long-term human project that dates back 50,000 years. It's such a fascinating idea.
That was actually the first movie that I saw in 3D. Just realized. Anyway. Well, I think we're at a point now. If you want to turn it over for any questions from the audience, for Daniel, for Mark, even for myself, if you have one. Yes.
I found that concept of caveness a little bewildering, to be honest with you. When I was in there, I was thinking, well, it's really odd to think that because we find this idea of a cave when the room is so highly illuminated. And I'm curious about the concept of the lighting you showed, because I would have thought that everything in there would have worked much better with lower lighting. So presumably that was your choice. And it does seem like it's the last word in enlightenment in a way, but the whole idea of the cave, to me, is the darkness and the absence of light and the possibility of what illumination might. Both of the Plato, all of these historical uses that concept of the cave tie in with the notion of enlightenment, where there's a tension between the darkness that's inherent in that enclosed space. And presumably those early cave paintings, I realize nobody knows what the hell those are, but the idea of a sham, that's a notion of illumination. It's not just, when I was reading those, sort of getting ready for the hunt or something, and now there's this notion of shamanistic illumination. In either case, the shamming undergoes a transformation, presumably, the transfer, and there's a moment of illumination. So anyway, I'm just rambling, but I'm curious, why the lighting of this, and it seems, from what you're saying, is that really you're not interested in caves from this epistemological and moral standpoint, but more of a metaphysical sense of a kind of absolute space and the kind of interconnectedness of things and so on. Whereas the cave as the epistemological space of uncertainty and hopeful illumination, that's not really your angle. Am I wrong?
Yeah. Well, I'm not interested in generating an experience of being in a cave, more so this reference and this extraction of the object of a cave as something to be presented. I think that there's a bit of the idea of playing with the light is fairly dramatic, and I feel like that also is a bit. It's not something I'm after, and I feel like a different type of museum could present that idea. If I was going to present a cave as the cave and reconfigure the experience, it'd be a different thing. But for me, I'm more interested in sourcing this reference and presenting it as an object, as an art object, rather than an experience. And that's also paired with the intervention of putting the gesture onto the piece itself. And I think that also goes in line with the other objects in the exhibition.
So if I could just play with that a little, it's such a fascinating intervention. By the way, I direct a museum, just a block down the street, which is a lot of natural history. We would love to do an exhibition on caves in which would be dark and people would explore with, if we're allowed to have flickering torches or something, on both the natural, historical, and the fascinating cultural history of caves. But even as it may, it's interesting because one of the interests, what is art? What is the function of art is fascinating. I mean, Paul Klee says art doesn't show what is visible, rather art makes visible. So there are different strategies for that process. And it seems to me that the work of art here in Field Station, in this iteration of Field Station, is to bring to consciousness within that well-lit space of the Contemporary Art Gallery a set of complicated processes which we reflect upon. But the literalism of reproducing the cave in its darkness wouldn't quite work for that, because it's not just about showing what is visible or showing what is invisible, but rather bringing to awareness a set of processes about mind and representation. So, but it's a fascinating point. What would it be like? I mean, the early Dadaist installations actually were dark, right? And you were given a flashlight or something you were supposed to go through and travel through the cave. Right?
It should be light. I just meant, why is it so bright? I mean, you actually reduce, I would think, I don't know, I haven't seen whether they're lighting, but I would think the things in the vitrines would actually visually more interesting if they weren't so highly illuminated. That light actually bleaches, it doesn't just reveal. So, presumably it was a choice. And similarly, it's not like, I wasn't thinking you pretend to be in the cave, but why get rid of shadow? You're making a choice there.
I think from my perspective, and certainly I had a hand in this as well, the way that it's lit, and where you're talking about that removal of shadow creates a flattening out, right? And so again, I think going back to this idea of the screen and the image or the kind of the surface that produces, to your point, a very kind of flattening out of those surfaces. So you're looking at something that's two-dimensional, but it begins to almost become very flat in a certain kind of two-dimensional way. And I think that ties into some of Daniel's larger kind of, again, to your point, metaphysical or kind of philosophical concerns. And the other point, I think, certainly there are some museums that, for conservation and preservation, will lower the lights or show things in much darker environments. But in terms of contemporary art, and with Daniel's interest in museological practices, he is presenting not a cave, but a sculpture, right? And he's not presenting just a tortoiseshell, but a sculpture in the vitrine. And so I think acknowledging the context in which he's showing these things, he's very much playing into perhaps the expectations or otherwise, those kinds of contextual considerations in doing so. I mean, I am curious now that you mentioned it to see what it would be like if we dimmed the lights in there, because, frankly, I don't know that we really ever went down that road, but it was certainly purposeful, and I think it would have, I appreciate your kind of attuned thinking and seeing how much lighting a show can really make a difference in its reading, but I don't know, I think that flattening out is actually in a way quite important, even if it means somewhat of a loss of some of the kind of three-dimensionality or the kind of textures and things like that of the work itself. That would be my reading of it. I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't seen it in low light, so I'm kind of curious about that too. It just, yeah. I agree with the one bit you said about, for me, they're like sculptural objects aside from theatrical objects. Maybe.
Yeah, and there's a danger there too, I think, of playing into that. I mean, it can be quite seductive to use very dramatic lighting, but it can be a bit, what's the right word? I don't know, novel, I guess would be the right word, It makes something seem more interesting if you light it in a very particular way than perhaps it is. Like you can make something seem, if you shine a spotlight on something by nature, in the same way that if you put a vitrine around something, you suggest an importance or kind of uniqueness perhaps. And I think, again, maybe that evening out of having something evening not just on the works but across the entire gallery is a strategy of kind of counteracting that kind of thinking or that kind of presentation method.
Well, the one thing I love, there's so many great things in these images, but one of the ones that's going by of the Mars rover, Daniel recently explained to us, so is embedded in the tread is the Morse code for JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, out of which, from where the Mars rover came, it's going by every once in a while. And I love that thought that there's this little quirky robot being bravely traversing the Martian surface, leaving this little enigmatic trace of Morse code again and again and again. That someday future visitors will be able to decode, but our great-great-great-grandchildren or something like that. It's or some species we can't even imagine. There's so many wonderful little touches there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately we didn't get into we talked some time travel. I'm glad you brought that up, Mark. We didn't get it too much into the space travel stuff. But,
right.
Yeah, Ellen, go ahead.
Throughout was thinking a lot about time, that much of what you talk about in your work, that the images here reference something that either is very far away or just happens to track or trace. And I kept trying to think of that in the context of the point you were making about the horizon line and the sublime. And for some reason, it sparked in me a recollection when Mark and I were at Indonesia, I was doing research there, and the Pacific is everywhere, and it's huge, and it's kind of irrelevant, to expect. And particularly when we're out in the ocean in any kind of way. And people invariably would mention, well, really watch carefully at sunset. Sunset, right at the horizon line, there would be a flash of iridescent green.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to watch really carefully. And that's just natural thing that happens. And I think maybe I saw it once. But it certainly kept me looking at the horizon line. And it was right at when the sun disappears below the horizon line. And the infinity of that gesture, sun is immortal, where it go? It's gone. And it's below this unforgiving line, the horizon. But the down moment is marked by this flash, of cinematic. And I don't know where to go with it in terms of this work. It was such a tiny instant, so minute that you get this flash of things that it resonated, I think, with some of the things that you seem to be playing with here. Here's something that seems to endure beyond time, that traces as memories of an instant.
I've tried to seek out that flash as well. I haven't seen it. There were about 3 instances where I waited to see it, and it just passed in that split second before I could catch it, I guess. Yeah. I believe it happens, but I think that I can say something by going back to this idea that I had about generating a provenance of the cave that I went to itself. And I didn't realize this until I did this thing where I got this 3D scanner. It's like really high-tech 3D scanner that's used to scan building facades, massive data points. And I brought it to this cave system, and I brought it to this cave that I had sourced these fragments from. And I produced a very, very detailed 3D model of the entire cave that I've been referencing and sourcing these fragments from. So now I have this digital model of the entirety of this cave, very detailed, and it's pretty surreal to feel like I have this object. I have the object of this cave that I can scale. I can produce it at the scale that it exists, or I can make a model this size. And it was only after making this 3D scan that I realized, oh no, this is a thing. This cave is important now. Now I have the entire cave. Now it's this idea of caveness is fixated upon this one place. It's not all caves. It's this one thing because I have the entire thing. And I think about that based on what you're saying, because in capturing that cave and taking this 3D model of it, 3D scan to generate a 3D model, it took place over maybe 2 hours. And I produced 10 different scans of the interior of this cave, and then took those 10 and merged them into one. And what is fascinating about that for me is that I now have this preserved digital artifact of this place. That cave could cave in and could disappear, but I have this thing from this moment in time that I sourced it from. It's almost like a mold. It's an exact replica of a moment.
Right.
And it's captured and preserved, and it can be reactivated at any time.
What's one thing? Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to piggyback on your point, and also the idea, this idea that I actually hadn't thought about it in your work. I ended up doing different kinds of conversations about it. Of kind of the horizon is something that once someone experiences somatically and physically, you can determine it. So whatever viewpoint your body is at, whatever direction you are, and you determine this is your horizon that you want to follow or you want to be there. So it is also about ownership and claiming that. And it is also very beautiful Curator to see it on the other space that these, I don't know where they are, it's kind of it's called something around the horizon. And also the directionality of the Earth, like the directions of the Earth, some of one's claims what east, what west, what's north, what's south. So it also kind of who first saw something, who first had the power, and then you also have the history about the issue of power and hierarchy, who determined all these points in Earth and in history, and who claims that history. And again, that also made me think of the Plato and the concept of archaeology. And in archaeology, whoever finds someone first, they put their name on it. So like the history of archaeology and the history of archaeology we know now depends on the few people who have the power and who have the opportunity to find those objects in time and mark that time and stabilize that time and make a photo, as you said, of that time. So kind of like looking through your exhibition, you kind of start on these ideas of leveling those hierarchies. And you said that, again, in terms where in awe, when you realize that you kind of like have claimed that cave, you out of nowhere that cave could be yours because you don't think the modern knowledge, no, yours conceptually, because you're attached to it. You didn't want it to be a thing that your pre-existed and was already established. But some ways that you created a thing that was established to be shared for it. So it's an interesting play to see this concept in relation to the power of it. How the power that is working and what direction comes pointing to the concept of leveling, leveling power. So, an American outlet goes to Europe and actually doesn't have access. It's very political. It's also about politics.
Yeah.
So, and then like, the pictures are burning in my mind, ending up in this field of the end, which, points out to a nowhere space,
Yeah.
where it has no horizon. It has no determined, directionality, east, west, so it's kind of like a space that of pause, pause of those power dynamics. And but at the same time, it is a piece of opportunity to have sound and music, which is also a concept where there isn't much, when sound exists in space, when all those stars are level, that everyone is listening to that thing that we can listen to, but you have music that potential sound. So I was curious if you talk less about that piece, that journey that I took on, why does it end there? What did you talk about that piece that I was watching?
Yeah. Fantastic.
I'll
I could throw something out while you're pondering that. If you want. I mean, these two commentaries are so interesting. I mean, it makes me think about all the fascinating things anthropologists have been learning about human prehistory. I mean, and that phrase you had about, who first saw something and who therefore claims it. And so to what extent is what Daniel has done through all these high-tech, scanning things that allow him to now keep forever this abstracted form in the cloud and somehow possess this hitherto unknowable place? I mean, human beings invented fire about 1 million years ago, or our hominid ancestors. And it seems like the first thing we do, crazily enough, is go into caves and, encounter bears and all those things and become bears, right, through the clan of the cave bear and all that. And then not so long after, it turns out, we crazily go out into the open ocean. We used to sort of imagine that the early boats only sort of kept close to the land. Well, there's increasing evidence that very early we head out into Nowheresville, off the charts, which was insane, and yet there's something about this crazy thing, the human mind, at least starting 50,000 years ago, that ventures out into these places that are completely unknowable and only have horizon lines, which is an experience, that great vault of the heavens, of the turtle's shell, which is the cosmos. And why we do that, I don't know. But, and that's where I think the linkage to the outer space ventures, we've sort of been headed there for a very long time, to that flash of something that Ellen mentioned on that distant horizon line, precisely that we seem to be constantly headed insanely towards these spaces that are completely unmoored, in which we can somehow know and not know the eternal. And that's one of the things of whether or not we're going into caves or into the impossible, dangerous open ocean that we seem to keep on doing. And it is interesting that in your artistic practice, you keep on taking us into those distant journeys.
To respond to what you're referencing with the chime, it isn't. So it's actually tuned. The chime can make sound, and it's a very specific tone, and it's not random. It's based on certain keys, but I wanted them to be silent and just to allude to this idea that they could potentially make a sound, and they could emit this tone, or these tones. And the title of it is very important, and Mark has alluded to it with coordinates that it points to. And with the chime, what I'm thinking about with that is wrapped up in this idea of the horizon as well. And from that, I'm taking a kind of a hint from a Proustian analogy, where he speaks about the sensation of tasting a madeleine. And for him, the taste of this food, in a sense, teleports him back to childhood, to this experience he had, that this taste, this sense, was able to activate this inherent experience, a transportation in time to a different place. And with the chimes, the simple idea that I have for that is that the tone is a sound that activates the experience of being placed in the location that the coordinates point to. So for me, what I find interesting is this leap in thought, and this idea that an auditory sound could then generate a very, very intense, sublime experience of being placed in the middle of an ocean. That the tone that these chimes would produce would be this overbearing sensation. And I like that it still remains conceptual, so you don't have the opportunity to hear them, but it's a muted object, and it's still contained. It's potential. It could occur, but it doesn't. And it's a moment of pause, which I like. A focused thinking through what this object is, which is familiar. We understand this as a chime. And it's also, I admit, tempting, because the sail of the chime is in fact the grip of a hand, of an absent hand. So it's very inviting to, make this sound, to be transported there.
With the guards constantly there to make sure you don't grasp.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Sorry to them. Apologies about that. But that's another thing that's wrapped up in a lot of the things I make, is this direct tactile connection, where there's finger impressions, there's a grip with the absence of a hand, and it's all inviting to touch, which is difficult because they're art objects, but yeah.
Well, I would just like to point out that in all of our conversations leading up to the exhibition, I think in particular I was a bit dismissive about the idea of including one of the chimes, and felt that with the new work and the other objects that we had already discussed, that seemed like a coherent and tight kind of exhibition. And thank God Daniel had the wherewithal to bring one with him when he came out to do the installation, because now when I look at that exhibition, I think that piece is in many ways the linchpin to the show, in ways that perhaps I can't fully articulate, but yeah, so I always believe in Daniel's intuition. I think that's what drives a lot of his work, and certainly that was the case here again.
Yeah, I love that it hints at, it doesn't let us hear the music of the spheres, right? So, which is, again, that early modern longing for the sublime.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, I think, sadly, we've run our course. We've run out of time for this evening, but I just want to say thank you again, everyone, for coming out. Unfortunately, now the museum is closed, so I think we need to kind of usher ourselves out of here. But if you haven't seen the show yet, again, I would just like to say that it's open for a couple more weeks. It closes on October 1st, Sunday, October 1st. So please come back and check it out, maybe with fresh eyes, with fresh ears, although they won't do you any good. Fresh ideas, yeah. So thanks, and thanks again to Daniel and Mark.
Yeah, thank you.